morning, everyone, and welcome to today's WIOA Wednesday webinar. My name is Brittany Boston, and I am at the Illinois Center for Specialized Professional Support, and I will be your facilitator for today's webinar. Before we jump in, I do want to take care of a few housekeeping items. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be available for view at a later date. I did want to mention that due to some technical difficulties, we are unable to provide closed captioning for the live webinar, but it will be available in the recording, which will be posted sometime later next week. As participants, you are in listen-only mode, so if you have a question, please feel free to plunk those into the chat or questions box throughout the webinar. Or if you have a working microphone and feel comfortable, you can raise your hand and I can unmute you and you can ask your question that way as well. So before I hand it over to our presenters, I would like to do a poll to kind of see who all we have on the call today. So if you could take a few minutes to answer which partner you are representing. And I'll give it a few minutes here to see how many we can get in. Okay, give it about 10 more seconds. All right, we'll go ahead and close this, share our results. So it looks like we have a lot of Title I representation, a little bit of Title III, some other WIOA partners and stakeholders. Okay, so thank you all for joining us. And then we also would like to know, where is your local area? So we'll give you a few seconds to answer this as well. Do 10 more seconds on this one. All right, we will go ahead and close this poll. Share results. It's like a lot from Chicago, Central Illinois, Northern, Southern. So it looks like we have a pretty wide representation when it comes to the state of Illinois. All right, and so with that, I will go ahead and hand it over to Nikki and Sarah from National Disability Institute for today's webinar.
Thanks, Brittany, and good morning, everybody, and welcome. Thanks for being here. Today, we're going to talk about strategies in addressing program alignment in customer service, and specifically the Community Resource Academy and the Integrated Resource Team strategy. So if you want to change the slide for me, Brittany, that'd be great. So here we are, myself, Nikki Powis, and also Sarah Loiseau. We both work for the National Disability Institute, and Sarah works partially on the Disability Employment Initiative and also the Workforce Innovation Technical Assistance Center as a subject matter expert on many things, to include the Integrated Resource Team. And I work with also a couple of different projects, also the Workforce Innovation Technical Assistance Center, and subject matter expert too on several things to include integrated resource teams. So that's a little bit about us. We both have been in the field and in workforce development for many years. And so, yeah, so hopefully we can share some information that'll be useful for you today. If we can go to the next slide. So our objectives for today's presentation is so that you can sort of understand the integrated resource team strategy and how it can be applied to your work. Some of you may already have been involved in this. If you've had previous disability employment initiative grants under U.S. Department of Labor Employment Training Administration, you may have already been involved in some, and that would be great. You can certainly let us know in the chat or in the questions box. We also want you to understand how the IRT strategy really fits into the Illinois workforce system priorities. Some of your local workforce investment boards and partners have been involved in identifying some workforce priorities for systems change efforts. And so this sort of fits really nicely into those priorities, recognizing the benefits of the IRT strategy for customer service, identifying resources that will support collaborative teams in using that strategy, and a little bit about one of the models that we've used called the Community Academy, and then kind of learn a little bit about how to structure and conduct IRT meetings. So if we can go to the next slide. So connecting the IRT to both your workforce system priorities there in Illinois and also WIOA. So if we can just take a look at the next couple of slides, I'd like to quickly kind of go over those. So as I mentioned, some of the Illinois local workforce investment boards and other local offices and programs have been working on some sort of cross-agency streamlining somewhat with some of the other team members from the Workforce Innovation Technical Assistance Center and other strategies. And so the priorities that really fit really well that have been identified, and some of you may be on those teams, you may be familiar with this, some of you may not be, but some of the priorities really include communication across the one-stop programs, cross-training, using the customer input to design and really deliver those services, so using sort of a customer-centric approach, streamlining and aligning processes across programs, sharing of customer information, certainly the career pathways piece, and then delivering services by function. And as we'll sort of see as we go through the IRT, this model really helps with these priorities and can move some of these forward and kind of be the bus that can sort of really get things on the road and moving. So if we can go to the next thing, we also want to look how WIOA and the IRT really fit together as well. So as I'm sure, you know, we had a lot of folks from Title I and other stakeholders. So I'm sure nobody needs a lesson in WIOA. You've been living it for several years now. But that certainly calls for streamlining and collaborating across core programs, and really includes the development of that common unified state plan and the cross-system program, the common measures, everybody kind of working together for the good of everyone, and also focusing services on specific target populations that may have a little more barriers to employment and using those wraparound services. So when we look at the integrated resource team as a model, it really does streamline services across the different agencies and is a team approach, so really speaks to what WIOA is asking for. And it also offers a tangible model for providing that wraparound services based on the individual need of each job seeker to help them reach their employment goal, which obviously is one of our common performance measures, is employment. So if we can go to the next screen. You know, there's many qualities of the IRT that really make it an important strategy for WIOA. So it is customer focused. It's definitely outcome driven. It's informal. So it's a team that can come together without a lot of bureaucracy, without a lot of red tape, without a lot of signed MOUs, things like that. And it's really applicable through multiple outcomes. So whether the outcome, we always look at it as employment, but if there needs to be a training first or some skill development first, then that may be sort of the primary outcome in the beginning with employment once that's been achieved. So multiple outcomes. We go to the next slide, Brittany. So let's take a look at conceptualizing the IRT. We can move on. Okay, so this picture here really tells its own story. You know, it may look very familiar to some of you, and the sort of siloed approach that many agencies have taken in the past and how WIOA really has attempted to break down. I recently had an experience with more of the medical model where I'm working on trying to coordinate services around healthcare for a family member. And it really sort of brought this home to me, how, you know, you go from one medical facility to another and you have to continue to keep repeating the story, and nobody really knows what's happened before, and nobody really is part of the global big picture solution. And, you know, that's really what the, you know, I wish I could have an IRT within the medical model, and was actually talking to someone the other day who said they had a family member go to the Mayo Clinic, where it actually is very much like that. The team of medical professionals come together, they discuss with the patient, everybody knows what's going on, you don't have to repeat your story. But, you know, that tends to happen within workforce. You know, I mean, if somebody goes into an American Job Center and they're accessing the self-help resources in a room where they're developing a resume or something, and then they're also involved in a housing program that has a work component and they want them to develop a resume, and then perhaps they have a disability and they're working with Voc Rehab, and Voc Rehab says, hey, let's develop a resume. And so now we have 3 different resumes. And I mean, I'm preaching to the choir. I'm sure you're all familiar with how people have to completely reinvent themselves and retell their story, and how they have different expectations of different systems, and how frustrating that can be for the individual. So if we go to the next slide, and we kind of look at the difference in the visual here with the people holding hands around the world there, because that's the IRT connection. The IRT connection puts the customer at the center of everything. And the medical providers, financial specialists, educators, housing providers, faith-based organizations, counselors, case managers, any system or any program that the person is involved in or could be involved in to benefit themselves moving forward into employment comes around them and is a part of a team that collectively communicates and talks about what happens with the customer at the center, and they are driving the bus. They are at the center of everything and communicate with everybody. So just sort of a different visual picture of what we saw with the siloed approach. We can go to the next one, Brittany. So I mentioned before that if those of you that are on the webinar may have been involved in the Disability Employment Initiative or Disability Program Navigator grants that came out of USDOL, Employment and Training Administration, that's where the IRT was born. And it came from a response to kind of the recognition that there was this challenge of multiple systems and people having multiple barriers and needing to access different services from different people, and how confusing that was, how duplicative it was, and that sometimes the individual wasn't able to access all the resources they needed, and that there was a need to address those resource gaps. There was a need to pull it all together. And so that's how the IRT was born out of those. So just a little bit of a historical background on that. So if we go to the next one. So what exactly is an IRT? I'm doing a lot of talking, and some of you may know, some of you may not. So it is initiated on behalf of a customer who has multiple barriers to employment that addresses each individual's specific needs. So it's a team of folks that come together from diverse service providers to really strategize and coordinate what that individual needs in order to maintain and retain employment. Employment is always at the center of everything, and the person is at the center of everything. As I mentioned before, it's an informal agreement, so there is no need to develop MOUs. Of course, you have to go through your normal processes of releases and things like that, that somebody, in order for folks to talk to each other. But if you think about it, if you have the person and you coordinate a team around the person and you're all together at the same time, then all those things can be signed and sorted out in one foul swoop, and it's much more effective, both time-wise and for the person themselves. The customer and the team of service providers come together, and there's 3 main components to an integrated resource team. There has to be a customer identified and mutually agreed upon employment goal. So all service providers that are working with the individual need to have consensus with the individual around their employment goal. Obviously, it is customer driven. Sometimes we do run into somebody that maybe has a little bit of an unrealistic goal. So sometimes it's helpful for other people to sort of have that conversation collectively to determine what really makes sense for the person. Lines of communication. How and where are people going to communicate with each other? How is everybody going to know what's happening and continue with progress so that everybody's aware and everybody is moving in the same direction collectively? And then the sequence of services. Again, we had some Title I folks, on the webinar. So perhaps you have an individual that you're working with to get into training services. And after a certain point, you're probably going to do an exit and then continue with your follow-up for a period of time. But perhaps the person still needs to stay connected with someone. So if that's the case, there might be a sequence that says, okay, I got this now, I can lead this now, but down the road, I'm going to phase out and someone else can take over, so that it's that continuum and there's always a support in place. And it might turn into natural supports. It's not just going to be agencies. So let's go to the next one. So the goals, again, really are to enhance that cross-agency, cross-system collaboration and communication. It makes everyone's job easier. Sometimes people sort of hear about this model and they're like, oh gosh, it sounds like an awful lot of work to coordinate all of this. And it can be upfront to get everybody together to determine who's going to do what, which pieces and parts of the puzzle is going to be provided by what agency, and how it's going to all work together, and how the individual is going to move forward, and what their goals and things are. But once it's running, we're going to give some examples of some stories towards the end, and it just is so much easier because it's a village, right? There's a village around this person, and it's not always one person's job to try and make things happen. It really does promote relationship building. People really start to learn about one another's programs and who can do what. And it's really easy then to pick up the phone and say, hey, I've got this other person who may not be in an integrated resource team, but I know so-and-so is able to help with what their issue is right now. Resources can be coordinated. So we're going to blend some resources. You may be contributing some, everybody's checkbooks paying a certain piece of the puzzle. So no one agency has to take the burden of everything. In shrinking budgets, nobody has, an infinite amount of money. So really leveraging what other people can provide and knowing what they can provide and how everybody can coordinate both resources in person, their time, attention, and also funding. As I mentioned, it is customer driven. The customer drives the bus. They are the person who is in charge of their movement, their plan, communicating with everyone, and it's based on their unique needs. So no resource team is going to be the same because everybody has a different need. It does promote that shared accountability. So, if we've got a team of people coming around someone and the customer says they're going to do something, they now have maybe 5, 6, 7, 10 people that they're accountable to. And likewise, the agency is too. So it really does. And it also breaks down sort of miscommunication or different stories to different people. Shares resources, I already said that. And then also everybody wins. The outcomes can be shared across all titles for common measures. Whatever the positive outcomes are, everybody wins. So the next slide, Brittany. So remember, it is an approach used for an individual customer. It's not an interagency committee meeting. You're not talking about systems collaboration, although that is an output of it because it does enhance that, but you're talking about and with the individual person for their individual needs. And the main purpose of it is employment. It's not to resource map or anything else, although obviously identification of resources that this customer specifically themselves needs is a part of it, and Sarah will go more into that in a minute. But it is the goal of an integrated resource team is an employment outcome. Next one. So who participates? I mean, anybody that makes sense to the person's life, anyone in the workforce system, behavioral health, folk rehab, community work incentives, if someone's on social security benefits, employment specialists, housing, could be high school, could be post-secondary, the employer themselves, if they're involved, correctional system, TANF. I mean, you can take a look at this slide, transportation services, apprenticeship sponsors, veterans, if they're a veteran, and not to forget advocates, friends, and natural supports, parents, someone that's going to be there and be an advocate and a support from a natural support perspective. This is definitely not an exhaustive list. It could be anybody that is useful to that individual's plan. Go to the next one. So because we need to look at who all can be involved, who do we know, how do we access the resources in our community? You know, one of the things that we found, and we've worked across the nation on developing pilots in very many states with the workforce system or the vocational rehabilitation agencies. And one of the things we found is even folks that really are clued into their community service providers, they know what their resources are, there still oftentimes are things that they don't know about, that they, you know, somebody gets a new grant at the community college that helps promote a certain high growth industry, and hey, we didn't learn about that yet. So one of the things that we found was really useful was to bring communities together and invite as many possible resources that may be useful to somebody who's looking for work and has some of these barriers and that we typically work with, and really try and get to know one another. So if you go to the next slide, Brittany, just a quick kind of snapshot on what we've done. We've sort of facilitated these in many parts of the nation, and we've always had people walk away saying, oh my goodness, I met people I didn't know existed. I met programs I didn't know existed. I can really see how useful now some of these things are for the people that I work with and how we can pull them into an integrated resource team. So basically the premise is that you have, you know, obviously with COVID-19 right now, we can't have large gatherings, so it would be for further down the road, but you have a convening of every single partner that you could possibly imagine might be useful. You bring them all together. They talk about what services they have to offer, their eligibility criteria, their outcomes, and what their main goals and missions and values of their program are. So you really kind of get to know one another. And then you also have a little bit of an integrated resource team training, so everybody knows what the goal and strategies of the IRT are. So when you leave that day-long event and you have an individual you're working with, you can call somebody up that you've just met and say, hey, I've got someone, I want to do this integrated resource team. You talked about what you've got available. So it really also produces that out-of-box thinking, builds those relationships, and really increases the brainstorming and the effectiveness of what you can do. So that's just a little bit about a community academy. We have, you know, much more information on it. It would probably take the whole time to just talk about that, but we wanted to mention that that's what we've used as a strategy so that people really get to know their partners well, and everybody can understand what this model and this strategy is and why you might be calling them and inviting them to a meeting. So let's go to the next slide. So when we think about coordinating an IRT, there are several steps to that, and I am going to turn it over to Sarah to talk about how we go about doing that.
Thank you, Nikki. So an IRT as a flow of services. If you think about it, you want to make sure that everything you're doing when you're putting an integrated resource team together is going in the right order. And it starts with career exploration. That's where you're sitting with your customer, and this is probably something you're familiar with doing in your job right now, figuring out what is it that the customer needs to reach an employment outcome. What is it that they're looking to do? Will they need training? Could they just go right into a job? Do they need soft skill development? What is it that they need? Figuring out that career exploration, the goals and needs, that's your first step. Once you have that, you want to move into something we call active resource coordination. And there's kind of two components to active resource coordination. One is it's resource planning. You want to figure out with the customer you're working with, what are the resources that they're already accessing in the community? Do they have mental health services? Do they live in a sober living program and they have to worry, are they on probation? Do they have a housing coordinator? Who are they already working with in the community that may be important for them reaching that employment outcome? And you can think beyond, obviously, we really think about this holistically. It's beyond just employment. Anything, any sort of resource or need a person has that could inhibit them from having a successful employment outcome, those are the resources you're thinking of. And then the other component is positioning to access resources. What are the resources that somebody is not getting yet, but that you know would be crucial for them developing a positive outcome? So again, it's what is the person already accessing, and then what is it that they need to access? And once you have that figured out and put together, then you can put together the integrated resource team where, and I know Nikki mentioned these three components, they're very important. We'll be repeating them. It's identifying a common employment goal, setting up the lines of communication, and putting together the sequence of services, or like the order of events. And then once all of that's done, you will hopefully have a very positive outcome. So next slide. So that first step about career exploration and need, as we had noted in the previous section, the purpose of an IRT is to help the consumer attain their specific employment goal. Career exploration serves as the first step in developing an IRT. The career exploration should result in a proposed employment goal that is self-determined, strength-based, concrete enough to build a plan around, and meets the required outcomes of the systems accessed. So this is probably something you are already doing when you're working on employment goals. That's not going to change. That is always going to be the first step in helping us move this along. Next slide. So once that employment goal has been identified, you're going to want to consider the following. Then it will help you so when you move into active resource coordination. One is the employment goal. Are there resources and or expertise beyond what is available from your own system that are critical to your customer success in attaining the proposed employment goal? Will they need training? Is it important for them to have a job coach? Do they have to have a resume put together? Do they have clothing for an interview, transportation? So you want to think about what is it that they're going to need to reach that employment goal. But then you also want to think about the customer. What other systems is your customer currently accessing? And are there other systems that can help them attain and retain the proposed employment goal? Then just thinking about the customer themselves, will they need childcare? Do they need to make sure that they're paying for their prescription medication so they can actually be healthy enough to go to work? You want to think about the person holistically and whatever it is that they're going to need to reach that employment goal. Next slide. So once you've got that figured out and you've worked with your customer and you know the resources they need and the resources that they're already accessing, then we can move into a step called active resource coordination, or an ARC. And ARC is basically the process of identifying needed resources and appropriate and prioritize action steps to address specific targeted barriers to employment experienced by an individual customer. Like I've said before, this is something you're likely already doing during the process of intake and plan development. A lot of us, that's usually a part of our job. We're figuring out, you need, you're having trouble, you know, need food stamps. I know the person you can call to get food stamps. You know, you're having issues with transportation. This is who you would need to contact. I am confident you guys are doing that in your job all the time. With compared to with how the current service delivery models are, we do this, we kind of say active resource coordination is a more enhanced and intentional step. It's, you're doing it on purpose. There's a plan to it. And it's more than just a referral to multiple service providers. This is not just handing someone a flyer or a business card and saying, come back when you've talked to this person. Active resource coordination is the process of helping the customer create that goal-specific employment resource plan. So we're putting this on paper. We're going to see exactly what this person's going to need, and we're going to make sure that we're not missing any of those steps. It's very easy to get lost in the shuffle for a customer. It can happen all the time, where they'll say, I called and I was put on hold and then they hung up on me. I missed the deadline to take the test that they said I was supposed to take. And, you know, these things happen all the time and it can set us back. When you do active resource coordination, it really helps us to have a very intentional plan so it helps us move forward. Next slide. Next slide, I'm sorry. So active resource coordination is this idea you're directly assisting the customer to convene and negotiate with multiple service providers to create an employment plan that accesses needed resources from multiple systems. Some considerations when you're determining if your agency does active resource coordination would include the following. Are referrals given before or after the development of an employment goal? Are you saying to a customer, you have to come back when you've met this certain requirement? If so, that's not active resource coordination. Active resource coordination, we've developed that employment goal and we're accessing the resources simultaneously. And the other question you want to ask is communication between the service providers solely the responsibility of the customer? As I had said before, with active resource coordination, this is an interactive process. And sometimes you hear people say, well, I don't believe in just holding the customer's hand. They need to take personal responsibility. And that's absolutely true. And I think that when you do this, you'll see that your customer actually is more involved, because once you work with them and you show them how the system works and you help them understand eligibility, it really is an even more interactive process. And as I mentioned before, there's less of that getting lost in the shuffle. There's less of that idea of like, you know, something gets forgotten or we're misstepped, or we don't understand how eligibility works for something, so someone misses a deadline. Those are things that we don't want to see happen. And because of that, it's really important that active resource coordination always takes place prior to putting that integrated resource team together. And you can do active resource coordination without resulting in an IRT. So for example, if you have a customer you're working with that needs a couple of resources that you help them get and they've obtained them, and now they're ready to step into their employment goal and there is really no other further work that needs to be done, that's fine. You can do active resource coordination without an IRT. But what you cannot do is have an IRT without first having done that active resource coordination. Next slide. So I know I've been harping on this, but it's a really important distinction. This is more than just a simple referral. As noted on the previous slide, it includes helping the customer to engage and approach partners around the potential for partnering with your agency. Many agencies will provide information and referral, but the customer may not understand the relevance of a referral or the steps that need to be taken. Active resource coordination helps the customer to identify, engage, and coordinate resources around their needs relevant to achieving their employment goal. We work in systems, and systems are almost designed to be difficult. And it can often happen with a customer, and even with myself, even when I've done active resource coordination and helped people, even I've experienced this is a complicated, complex, way to access something. And so when you walk with the customer and work with them on this, again, you're more likely to see those positive outcomes. When you're able to work with a customer and say, hey, when you go to this office, you're going to need to have your state ID or driver's license, your birth certificate. You're going to need to have, this contact information. When you can tell the customer and empower them in advance, it totally eases so much frustration and it makes everybody's job so much easier. And that's another reason why Nikki was mentioning the Community Academy, because that's a good way for people to learn how other agencies and how other operations work. Next slide. So there's 3 elements of every IRT meeting that you want to think of. One, it starts with the individual. As Nikki had said, the individual drives the bus. Without them, there is no IRT. If you think of, if you've ever been part of the IEP process in a school, you know sometimes you'll go to an IEP meeting and the student isn't there. That never happens with an IRT. The customer has to agree to it and want to be involved. And when you think of a customer that's appropriate for an IRT, because certainly not every customer you work with is going to need one, but you want to think of the customers who have multiple needs and barriers and that lack of coordination and someone who's maybe just stuck. So there's nothing that's preventing them from moving forward in reaching their employment goal. That's someone who's usually a good candidate for an IRT. The other element you want to think of is the team itself. And again, it's led by the job seeker. They are driving the bus. Professional support is only a facilitator. So you may be facilitating the IRT, but you are not the one in charge. In fact, even when we do introductions, I always say it's a good idea for the customer to introduce everyone in the meeting around the room. This is my case manager. This is my vocational rehabilitation counselor. This is my job coach. Whoever the person is, that's what they mean to them. I think that's a really important way to introduce people in a meeting. Expertise in partnering is the key. The idea is you're bringing people to the table that are all working with this customer and how we can work together. Another element is you want to think about the plan. And I always say, never go into an IRT meeting thinking about the solution, but more about the puzzle. You don't want to come in and say, well, we're inviting people to this IRT that I know this person will pay for their transportation, and this person's going to take care of childcare, and this person is going to pay for their training, and this person's going to give them financial counseling. When you go into that, you're going to be disappointed a lot because it's not always how it happens. One, there may be information that you didn't know before the meeting. There may be some other barrier that hadn't been thought of. Also, IRTs evolve. They're the same people don't need to be in every IRT meeting. So it may be that you're working with a customer and disability services from the community college is involved in the beginning. But as the customer has gotten their certificate or degree, that person isn't needed, but maybe now a business consultant is needed or an on-the-job training coordinator. Someone new is coming in and another person's going away. That happens all the time. It might be that they change their employment goal to something else. They realize this is not the right goal for me. So IRTs will evolve. They don't need to always have the same people in them. And it's not tied to funding. We don't want to invite people into this process just because we know they can pay for A, B, or C. We want to know that that's somebody who has resources that the customer can benefit from to reach their employment goal. But again, we don't want to have a rigid idea of who can pay for what beforehand. Next slide. I know Nikki had showed this before about who could be on a team. So just quickly, it's almost anybody, but it always starts with the customer. And remember, it's holistic. So anything, any resource that a customer needs that could help them to reach employment is an appropriate person to bring into this process. And so if you think about the customer in that way, like what is stopping them? And sometimes we work with a customer and we know what's stopping them from reaching their employment goal has nothing to do with employment directly. They have interview skills, they have their resume, they have the clothes, and they know how to apply for a job, but maybe it's transportation or it's childcare, or there's some other issue that's happening. They can't afford their medication, so they are not well enough to go to work. These are all things you're thinking about when you want to put your team together. Next slide. So again, who should be at the table? You think of the employment goal. What are the resources beyond those available in your system that are critical to your customer success in attaining their employment goal? And you want to think of the customer. So just like with active resource coordination, that's how it's going to help you figure out who should be at the table. So who is the customer currently accessing? Who are they working with right now? they're living in a sober living home and they have a case manager and they have certain rules they have to keep for that. That's a good person to invite in. They're working with a Title I case manager or a vocational rehabilitation counselor. That's an important person to bring in. Maybe it's natural supports like Nikki mentioned. It could be, parents or a friend or, a spouse, somebody that is important in that person's life in helping them reach that employment goal. And again, when we do active resource coordination, we want to think about bringing people in that would help the customer also, that they may not be currently accessing. For example, if somebody is on SSI or SSDI, you might want to invite in a work incentives counselor that's going to help them understand how their benefits will be affected once they go to work. And so those are just really important. And once you've done that active resource coordination, this part about who should be at the table will be a lot easier. Next slide. So how do you approach partners? And so this is a question that I get a lot from people where it's like, this seems like it'd be really hard. People are really busy. No one's going to want to go to a meeting. How am I going to make this happen? And so I have a few tips for you guys about how to do this in a way that's successful, but I promise you it gets easier as time goes on. Before you approach a partner, you want to make sure that your customer is engaged by your system and positioned to access your system's resources. I wouldn't recommend starting active resource coordination the day you meet a customer. You want to make sure that you are going to be working with them. You have an employment goal written for them. You have an idea of what it is that you're going to be doing with them. So your customer should be presumed eligible for your services or already made eligible. The customer should have a determined employment goal that follows for the application of your system's resources. And the customer should be consulted and agreed to all contacts and have a clear understanding of the IRT approach and its benefits. This definitely starts with your customer. Let them know, I'd like to put this team together to help you reach your goal. And what we're going to do is we're going to coordinate our resources so that we can make sure that you are able to achieve what it is that you want to achieve without having any other issues. And they have to agree to the idea that these people are going to come together. You want to make sure privacy releases get signed if they need to. And you also want to reassure the customer that the only purpose of putting these people together is to help them reach their employment goal. If you're inviting in their mental health case manager, that person is not there to talk about all the other personal issues that might be going on. Only yes, they're going to therapy and they are taking their medication. That's what's important and that's what they're contributing to the process, and they don't need to talk about other things. Again, everything that's just related to that employment goal. Next slide. So connect to partners based on those individual needs and service gaps. Again, as I had mentioned before, you're connecting to services your customer is already involved in, who is already in the customer's life that is important to them reaching that employment goal, and then determine what other services they need to connect to and invite. If the customer needs to apply for services prior to attendance in an IRT, you're assisting them with that process. That's all part of active resource coordination. You want to ask the customer you're working with questions concerning the specific services that are being delivered. Try to get a little bit of information from them. For example, how long have you been working with this, person? And, how is it working out for you? And what has been the result so far? Try to uncover areas too where you and your partner might have some flexibility within established plans. And this might not happen until you actually have your meeting, but if you can figure it out beforehand, that's always great too. I give an example of a gentleman that I worked with who was on probation and he wanted to enter into an apprenticeship program. Well, the hours for the apprenticeship program conflicted with the time that he was mandated to meet with the probation officer. By inviting the probation officer into the process, the probation officer decided he could change the day of his appointment because he saw how this was an opportunity for the man he was working with to really move forward in his life. That's the kind of thing we're talking about. Another was and that same customer was living with his mom, and his mom said, you have 6 months and then you have to move out. The apprenticeship program that he was going to be in was 9 months. The mom, seeing the opportunity and being invited into the process, was like, that seems fair. I will let him live with me until he is finished with this program. So when you invite people in, it also helps that idea of people are willing to be more flexible when they understand all of the process and what's involved. Next slide. So then you want to convene the meeting. So once a customer is determined eligible by another service provider and these service providers are agreeable to partnering, you want to discuss with your customer their role as the driving member of the integrated resource team. After establishing the customer's role, a face-to-face meeting should be convened whenever possible with the partners and the customer. If a face-to-face meeting is not possible, virtual meetings are adequate. So once you've decided to have a meeting, I am a big believer in in-person meetings. There is something to be said about looking someone in the eye and saying, we will have this done by this date. It helps with accountability. It's really hard to like flake on somebody when you know them now personally and you've seen them. In the world we're living in now, this is, I know, a near impossible task. And virtual meetings are possible, and you can do them a variety of ways through, things like Zoom or go to meeting like we're on now or a conference call. You can plan out the IRT any way that works for your team. There's not one right way to do it. And the important idea is that you're coordinating the resources and we're all communicating with each other. That's the big part of it. The purpose of the meeting is to reach consensus around the following 3 key parameters. And we mentioned these before. I said I was going to repeat them a lot. 1, a common employment goal. Everyone agrees this is the employment goal the consumer wants to achieve, and we're all here to help them to achieve that in whatever scope of our job and way we do. 2, setting up the lines of communication. It's important to know, are we going to have, you decide here in this first meeting, are we going to have future meetings? How will those meetings be established? How are we going to continue to talk to each other? And who is the main point of contact? And sometimes for the consumer, the main point of contact may not be the person facilitating the meeting. It may be someone else who's much closer in their life. And so the customer feels comfortable saying, I will update this person and let them know how things are going. And that person that agrees to, update the team. You may decide like everybody sends, bi-weekly emails updating them and what they did with the customer and how that's working out. Or they decide we're going to do conference calls every other month to update. However you guys decide to do it, IRTs are like snowflakes. No two are alike. You guys can figure out based on the needs of the customer and based on what works for the team and how to do it. And you want to stress that when you're approaching partners. You want to say, we're doing this to help make your job easier, basically. You want to come into it with that idea of, this is what I can do for you, as opposed to the other way around. And it does work. When I first started doing IRTs, I remember working with vocational rehabilitation, and I was working in the Title I system. And vocational rehabilitation counselors would say to me, I have 120 people on my caseload. I do not have time for this. And then once they saw that working with me, I basically was handing them their plan for employment, saying, well, I've worked with this customer and I know exactly what they need and what needs to be paid for and all of this. And I'm basically bringing it to the counselor. Now counselors were more than willing to be part of an IRT. They saw how it was advantageous to their job. And that really does happen. And then lastly, you want to talk about the sequence of services. The order of events is so important. You want to make sure who is coming into the IRT meeting. I had mentioned earlier how IRTs can evolve, is there in the right time and purpose. What does the person need first? And, Maslow's hierarchy of needs is a good way to start in this. Food, shelter, clothing. What are the most basic things the person needs? And then you move from there about what else they need to reach that employment goal. So it may be that your sequence of services may mean that you're bringing people into this IRT and they may drop off for the next one. They may have already done what needed to be done. They're ready to move to the next step. But it's really important that you know and you have it written down when you do an IRT meeting, what are the sequence of services. I also say due dates are such a good idea. If you can say by this date in a meeting, this will be done. One, that's a really great way as you, the facilitator, to follow up. And I used to say, like, I would put in my calendar. So when I would do an IRT meeting and we'd have due dates, this person is going to meet with the financial counselor by this date. I would put it in my calendar. That way it would remind me, okay, I want to update this person on the IRT team to find out when they're going, what happened. So it's so important that you have that sequence of services. Next slide. So facilitating an IRT meeting and negotiating that multi-partner strategy is really not as hard as you might think it is. I know it seems like this is pretty complicated, but I promise you it actually makes a lot of your job easier. We can go to the next slide. So after the introductions have been made, so you're at the meeting, you've had the introductions and the purposes and concerns have been discussed. And again, whenever possible, have the customer do the introductions. You want to set out to reach consensus around those following 3 key elements that I've mentioned before: the common employment goal, the lines of communication, and the sequence of services. Next slide. So for the common employment goal, most service providers will have some sort of employment goal as an outcome to services, but not necessarily. It may be that you're working with someone who their goal is to keep somebody engaged in the mental health system. That's their goal. It's not necessarily to do with employment, but it's important that we're working with them. So you want to understand what everyone's goals and outcomes are, but that everybody agrees to the same employment goal. You don't want to have 2 different employment goals, and that conflict, that would not be a good idea. And each provider will have specific parameters as to how an employment outcome is defined. It may be that you're working with someone who says, successfully employed in 90 days, we close your case. And another partner may say, we have to see you successfully employed for 6 months. It may be that one partner says, we need them to work at least 25 hours a week. And maybe another partner says, we don't have a limit to how many hours they can work a week. But you want those things established, during the IRT meeting to figure out, what does each partner say? This is how we determine success. And then you want to discuss what outcomes are linked to resources accessed. So again, who is providing what resource and how is that going to help with the overall outcome? Next slide. So the lines of communication, as I had mentioned before, the customer agrees to the communication between partners. If a customer says, this person, I do not want a part of this process, you got to respect the customer. Even if you think that it's a really important partner, but remember, the customer is driving this, and without the customer driving it, it would be very hard to continue this. I've joked on customers before, I can't go to work with you every day as much as I want to. It has to be agreeable with the consumer. And you want to identify what information will be communicated. And again, as I had mentioned before, you want to stress that privacy. Only the things that are relevant to that customer reaching the employment goal should be discussed. And again, with the consumer present. And if you need to sign privacy releases or other things and you do that beforehand, that's definitely an important step as well. And then you want to identify how partners will be informed of progress or needs. So I mentioned this earlier. Your customer, you may want to have a specific person that's their point of contact that they're updating. You guys will all talk to each other about, this is how we will update. And you want to be flexible with the people you're working with, remembering, just like you, they're really busy and have high caseloads. So we all want to figure out what's the best way to work together so everybody knows what everyone else is doing and what's going on. The worst thing that can happen is you're working with a customer and you find out they dropped out of school and they haven't been there in a month. You don't want to wait a month to find out that that happened. That's why lines of communication is really important in figuring out who is updating who and how. Next slide. And again, the sequence of services, or like I would like to say the order of events. You want to determine which services are necessary at each point in a plan. And then you want to link services to milestones within the plan. Again, I am a big believer in due dates. Even if something doesn't have a hard specific due date, make one up at the IRT meeting. And you also want to find out when services stop for each provider. Again, as I had mentioned before, it may be that you both may have the same employment goal in your plans, but one person has a different strategy for when they say services stop than you do. And you want to know, that knowledge is important, that we know. This is what each person is expecting from the customer, and this is what the customer is expecting. And so, again, that also means that sometimes IRTs evolve. You may have somebody who they've already met their goal with them, they've dropped out, but maybe you're bringing somebody new in. But that's important that we have that sequence of services and we know these things. And when you're doing the outcomes and you're writing down like when things are due in that sequence of services, remember, everyone that leaves an IRT meeting should leave with something that they're agreeing to accomplish, including especially the customer, but definitely you want to include them as well. So, and then everybody's knowledgeable about who's doing what and when they're doing it by. Nikki's gonna show you a worksheet in a minute that we give as an example, but the idea is like if you write that down and make copies for everyone before they leave a meeting, or you email it out to people, that's a really good way for everybody to know those things. Next slide. So after reaching consensus around the employment goal and the lines of communication, agencies agree to provide specific supports and resources based on what is available through their programs in support of the customer obtaining their employment goal. Each agency completes their own specific plan and required documentation, and either indicates support provided by other agencies in their managed information system, or if their MIS has that functionality or case notes regarding partner involvement. Agreement around a timeline or need for further IRT meetings should also be discussed. So again, it's important to, like, especially when you're approaching partners, that they understand this. Nothing changes in the scope of their job. We are not asking anyone to do anything that's outside of what their job is. All we're asking is to have that communication be brought. So it's not, you're not asking someone to say, well, we want to change your program's eligibility because it'd be better for this customer. That's not what we're doing. What we're doing is we're saying we're going to communicate and work together to help the customer reach their employment goal through the scope of the work that you already do. Everyone completes their own paperwork. We're not asking for any extra different additional steps. A vocational rehabilitation counselor writes their own plan for employment. The Title I case manager has their own plan. They write them in their own systems. And again, it's also the same for outcomes then. Everybody benefits from that positive outcome. And I had mentioned before too, you want to have an agreement about how our future IRT meeting is going to take place, or if there is a need for future IRT meetings. It may be that one meeting in person works, and now we're going to be able to communicate via email, and then we're going to do conference calls every other month, or we're going to do it based on milestones. So once the customer is finished with their training program, now we're going to convene another IRT meeting. You guys decide as a team together what's the best way to continue moving forward. Next slide. So I'll just give you a quick review. Active resource coordination is the process in which you help customers identify resources that are beyond what your own program can provide, and help to engage those resources around a mutually agreed upon employment goal. Following active resource coordination, an IRT meeting is convened with the customer and partner agencies, in which, led by the customer and agencies come to consensus around, once again, the 3 key parameters: that common employment goal, setting up the lines of communication, and understanding the sequence of services. Customers and partners agree to roles and services consistent with their own agency's allowances, and plans are documented and moved forward. Next slide. So you want to think about a few things when you're putting this together. If you look at their work goal and their challenges, and again, I think it's a good idea to sit with a customer and map out what are all the resources that someone needs, and what are all those challenges. I'm big on writing things down and having it on paper. That helps me, but whatever way helps you learn. But these are the kind of things that you want to determine. What types of people, supports, resources does this individual need to reach their goal? With this information, then you should know who should participate in this individual's IRT. So based on the resources you've listed, and maybe a resource doesn't need to have a person in an IRT, it might be that once you've coordinated that resource, that can be done, but you're going to want to figure out, based on what you and the customer came up with together, this is a good person to participate in this process. You want to figure out which agencies or individuals would contribute to the success of the individual. Again, don't discount natural support. If, mom or dad, they're living, under their roof, they're probably maybe an important person to include in the process. So anybody that the customer believes would contribute to their success. And what other natural support should be at the table? And who will be the most productive advocate or mentor for this individual to assist with attaining their goals? And that may not be you personally. Even though you're facilitating the meeting, there may be someone closer to the customer who would be better with the communication, and the customer should really decide that. Next slide. So to set up your IRT for success and sustainability, you want to ask these following questions as well. Which agency would be best to provide the leadership and coordination for the IRT? So, who is probably the best person to head this up or lead this? Which role will each member of the team play? And that's the thing, everybody wants to know what the other person is doing, but remembering they're doing it within the scope of the work they already do. So who is responsible for what and when? Again, I'm a really big believer in setting milestones and due dates. How and when will the team communicate with the customer, with one another? Again, that's something you want to agree on as a team. Do you have a plan for supporting crises or roadblocks? So if something is a problem, how is that going to be addressed? Do you have equal resource sharing, time and financial, and do you have full buy-in from everyone? So someone comes to a meeting and is like, maybe I can help the customer with this. That wouldn't be a good idea. That's not, we want to know exactly what everyone is willing to do and what they have agreed to do. Does the individual have responsibility and buy-in? Again, a customer should leave an IRT meeting with their own set of things that they've got to do, their own due dates. The customer, you want them to be as involved in this as possible. And one thing that I've noticed with customers, they're more likely to want to be involved and continue their involvement when you've put an IRT together, because they can see, oh, this is actually possible. There are people that are going to be working with me. I'm actually getting this help. It's not theoretical anymore. So it really does help a customer actually stay actively in the process. Who will ensure forward momentum? Again, so who is going to make sure that everybody is communicating, who's facilitating, and do you have a plan for continuation beyond program exit? So you want to think about the end. What is going to happen once this resource ends, or once they've reached their employment goal? How are we going to further communicate from there? And so that's another question you want to ask. Next slide. So I'm going to go back to Nikki, and she's going to talk about how you negotiate the IRT plan.
Thanks, Sarah. One other thing, and I think you probably mentioned it, but as well as accountability of the individual, it's also very empowering. How frustrating sometimes is it to sort of have different people in your life that have different expectations of you, and you're trying to manage all that, as well as a bunch of barriers and being unemployed or whatever is happening in life. And I remember coming out of an IRT one time with the person, the lady saying, I feel like the queen of everything. And I'm like, what? And she said, it's amazing. Everybody's in this meeting and everybody's working with me and for me. And I don't have to try and figure it out. And she was so overjoyed, and it was so empowering for her to feel that people cared and they were all working and supporting her. So, I think that's, Sarah probably said it, but I just wanted to reiterate that, that is just so meaningful for folks whose lives are already complex and things are difficult. So, Sarah's gone through the components and everything. We have an example of sort of how you would document some of this. Again, it's informal. You don't have to have a certain document that says everything. You're going to have it probably in your own case management system or on your own individual employment plan or plan for employment or whatever it is that the vehicle that you use for that. But it's also nice to have sort of some kind of note that comes out of the meeting that everybody reaches that consensus on. And it does talk about what those sequence of services are. And the other thing is, if this is a document that's emailed out, then you can copy and paste it and put it into your management information system, and you don't have to go write case notes because everything's right here. You've got it all the stuff that you need. So this is just an example. This is kind of small, so it's hard to see it, but if we go to the next slide, this is just sort of the components of it. We just wanted to give you kind of an example of the type of thing you might use. So, here's the IRT meeting, the first part, the date of it, who attended, who they are, what their role is in that person's life, just so you've got sort of a roll call kind of, if you will, so you know who's there. This person had, again, we talked about whatever's relevant to the person's life. So their probation officer was there. They had a work incentive counselor. They're interested in going into an apprenticeship program. So there was a pre-apprenticeship coordinator talking about what that might look like. Math and reading tutor, because the chosen profession needed some upgrade in skills for math and reading. So they're going to talk about that. Anyway, go to the next one. So then here's sort of the agenda piece of this particular document. So, we've got what the employment goal is, how much they're wanting to make, how many hours they want to work. As far as the lines of communication go, we've, as Sarah mentioned, who's going to talk to whom, when, how is that going to work? So in this instance, there's going to be one person that's going to, the individual's going to approach with any challenges, and she's going to give biweekly updates to the larger group. And they're going to decide, okay, that's via email or however that's going to happen. And then the sequence of services here is, here's what we're going to do. We're going to enroll in this. Here's what each person that was on that previous participant list is going to provide. So Title I is going to pay for the tools and the learning materials. This person has a disability, so they have a vocational rehabilitation counselor. They're going to pay for the transportation. They've also agreed to purchase an accommodated piece of software that the person needs. And so, this sort of outlines what each person's going to do, how they're going to communicate, and that sequence of services, as Sarah already mentioned. So let's go to the next one. And then here's that accountability piece that Sarah also mentioned about putting down what that action is, who is responsible for it, and when is it going to happen by. So this individual needed to complete that pre-apprenticeship application. Remember, we had the pre-apprenticeship coordinator there. They explained what was needed, how they have to work it out. There's an application due. And so here's a couple of people who are going to work with, well, Jeremy is the customer, but the customer and someone else is going to work on completing that application. And here's the date it's going to be due by. And then the probation meeting schedule is going to be readjusted, and when's that going to happen by, and the date. So everybody knows exactly what their job is and when it needs to be done by. So again, you can use whatever document you want, but this has worked for other people, and it has all those components laid out that Sarah's gone into in more detail. So we just wanted to kind of show you an example of what you might walk away with from a meeting with as far as documents go and how everything is going to be outlined on that document. You want to go to the next slide? So hopefully now you can kind of get a feel for how an IRT might be different from what you're already doing. And we, both of us, like I said, we've worked in the workforce system. Sarah's worked for Title I. We've worked with VR. I've worked for a community college system with workforce development. So, I mean, we know that you do this. These are things that you already do. The difference really is that it is, number one, it's intentional. You're intentionally putting this together to make it for the benefit of really, truly wrapping services around the individual. We talk about things like collaboration. We talk about wraparound services, but to truly do it purposefully with intention and goals and get everybody together at the same time with the person driving the bus is a little bit different from some of the models that generally are out there. So, I'm sure many of you are going to say, we do this, I've done this, and many of you may have been involved in IRTs and certainly have used this model as well, and we'd love to hear that. So just to kind of recap some of the win-wins, I'm just going to quickly go through these. We want to have some time at the end for questions if people want to ask, or comments, or even stories of your own. So remember, it is that individualized approach. It promotes that active involvement and accountability of everybody. Again, it's dynamic. The services, the members, they come in, they come out. It's what is needed in that moment at that time. It's real time. It changes, it's dynamic, and it moves with the person. If there's how many times does somebody go to work, we think everything's great, and then there's a crisis and everything, they fall off the face of the planet or something happens. In this system and with this, there's a support system in place. There's contingencies for that, and it leads to a more self-sustaining approach. It is a team, it's holistic, Sarah said that. It leverages existing resources and avoids that duplication of service. That active resource coordination piece can really provide the vehicle for agencies to come together and provide those stabilization services and really prepare the person to be, fully able to do everything because you've thought about every piece and part. And the teamwork really does establish, again, it's some kind of organizing and coordinating on the front end, but once it's running, it really truly is a beautiful thing, and it does alleviate a heavy load on any one person. Go to the next one. You can designate a member to maintain the documentation. As I mentioned before, if you're going to have somebody's going to be the facilitator, somebody's going to be the note taker, they're going to send out the notes to everybody, you copy and paste it into your system, you're done. You don't have to go back and write it yourself, you can copy paste. It does promote that accountability and follow through. We've said that several times. And it also provides that single point of contact for the individual. They don't have to talk to their TANF case manager and their Title I case manager and their VR person and their housing person. We've already identified a single point of contact. The communication is going to go from that person to everybody. So they don't have to completely continue to tell their story and continue to update 5 different agencies. The IRT can happen anywhere. So it doesn't have to be in someone's office. Again, flexibility of your own systems and programs. Now, of course, it's probably happening on a Zoom meeting or something, and everybody's at their house. So that makes it even easier. But, people have had IRT meetings at coffee shops, or obviously confidentiality is an issue. So, maybe it's a room in a library, but you can go to where the person is if transportation's an issue. There's just so much more flexibility to it. Let's go to the next slide. It can establish complementary services and increase everybody's knowledge of other service delivery options. Again, like I said before, we have had so many times where people really have felt like, I know what's in my community. I know what everybody does, but there's a new program or there's this other thing they just had never heard of before. And it really brings all that strength to create a whole of the parts, and people really get to know more about what's available and how they can then use those services to help other people they're working with. I already mentioned how empowering it is for the individual. Those lines of communication are established so that everyone has that common understanding. And it provides a mechanism for sharing costs. Going back to some of the priorities for WIOA, big thing there is resource sharing, blending and braiding funds and services, and not duplicating. And it also builds the relationship between the individuals themselves and the staff they're working for. You get to really know a person and all the different components of their life, and increases kind of the empathy and compassion for perhaps what is happening and how things can be problem solved. Again, back to one of the things Sarah said, it's really not about the solution, it's about the puzzle. Putting the puzzle together to really help somebody be successful and move forward. Next one. So when we revisit, and I said at the very beginning, that Illinois has some local workforce investment boards and other offices and programs that have come together and worked to establish various different priorities that includes, communication across programs, cross-training to different staff, customer input to design and deliver what services they need, streamlining and aligning processes, sharing customer information, sharing understandings of career pathways and services being delivered by function and what's really needed for that individual. Now that we revisit those and you've heard all about the integrated resource team, hopefully you can see how using the integrated resource team is a vehicle to really implement every single one of these priorities. Use that as a model and all of these kind of fall into place. Go to the next one, please, Brittany. So we have talked a lot about what's involved, how it is, how it comes together. And we've got about 15 minutes left, and we do want to let folks ask questions. Remember, you can use the chat or the questions box if you want to. But we want to share a couple of stories so that you can kind of see how this might be a little bit different and how it might work to really help the person. So I'm going to tell you a story, and then Sarah's going to tell you a story. So we had an individual a few years ago, a young woman who had a couple of children, and she was using the American Job Center and had found a job. She did have a high school diploma. She didn't have any college or anything, but she found a job. She was okay with it. So the person that was working with her was happy and great, you got a job. And then something fell apart and she came back in. Oh, what happened to the job? Oh, well, I didn't like it, or I couldn't get there because my car broke down. So she found another job. She worked for that for a couple of weeks, and then there she was again, back in needing help with another job. What happened to this job? Oh, well, you know, they didn't like me, or there was a conflict or something. So this happened for a little bit. And then somebody said, you know, let's kind of meet with the person and see if we can, maybe does she need a little bit more supports? What else is going on? So we did a little bit of active resource coordination, found out that she was receiving TANF for her children, and that she'd had some other things. She had some depression and some mental health issues, and also was really worried about financing, had worked, you know, a few times, but also found out that she hadn't filed a tax return for 3 years. And in that particular American Job Center, there was a program for financial coaching. And so the financial coach came in, and also some support with tax filing, and said, you know, you can go back and file taxes 3 years back if the IRS owes you money, and that might help you with getting your car fixed or something, or we can see what else we can do. We can pull in some other resources. And so we sat down and had a meeting with her. And what came about because of that was the fact that, yes, she hadn't filed taxes, she had worked, she was actually eligible between the 3 years for about a $6,000 or $7,000 refund collectively over the 3 years. So that was money that she was missing out, but we would never have known about if we didn't have a financial person and a tax filing person helping. And then she also mentioned to the team that she was also having some struggles at home. And then we found out that she was living in a domestic violence situation. And that's why these jobs kept falling apart. It wasn't that she didn't want them or didn't like them. It was because the person she was living it with didn't like her going to work and being away. And that was creating a lot of stress. And that was why she kept quitting her jobs. And so the point is that we would never have known these things if we had just continued with her coming in, getting a job, quitting a job, coming back, without really sort of saying, you know, what's the story here? What's going on? Let's see who we can bring to the table. Who is she comfortable talking to, and about what's really happening in her life? And so as a result of that, the financial person did work with her. They did file back 3 years taxes. She did get $7,000. She was able to use that to get herself a different place to live with some other natural supports that she had. We brought in some family and get away from the situation she was in. She secured employment that she was able to go to, and she didn't have to quit. Her children were in a much better space. And the outcome of that was that she continued that job for many, many years. And this was a story from about 5 years ago. And as far as I know, she's still successfully working, has had various pay raises, and is moving on with life. But none of that would have happened without going through an active resource coordination and an IRT process. So that, to me, that sort of tells the story of the value of really getting to know the person and bringing in other resources that are going to be beneficial. Sarah, you want to tell us your story?
Sure. So one of my favorite success stories to share when it comes to IRTs is the story of a gentleman, and I'm not using his real name. His name was John for this purpose. And when I first met John, it was through the American Job Center and the Title I system. And he, at the time, was living in a sober living community or house, and he had just finished 4 years in prison. So he had a record. He also had a traumatic brain injury. So he had this prison record. He was living in this sober living house that had a lot of rules and regulations about when he had to leave and when he had to come back, but they had a work component. They said he had to go to work. So he also was severely behind in child support, and he was very afraid that he wasn't going to be able to earn enough money to ever pay that back. And he was getting SSDI, and the huge chunk of his SSDI check was going to paying this back child support. And he just felt like he was never going to get ahead, no matter how hard he tried. So he was definitely a good candidate for an IRT. I started with him. We worked with vocational rehabilitation and that career exploration goal. And we learned that he once worked in heating and cooling, and he was kind of handy. And so we knew about an opportunity to work as a CNC machinist, and the class was coming up. So he was able to enroll in that class. And then the VR counselor helped pay for his, transportation to get back and forth to this class. We, as the Title I system, we helped him pay for the class itself. Then we brought in his sober living coach, because one of the problems that he was facing was they said, you have to work this many hours a week. And you also had to be in that house at certain hours. Well, that was very challenging because it was very hard for him to find a day job that was going to work for all their conditions. So we invited the manager of the sober living house to come into the IRT, and again, made flexibility. We told him about the opportunity that John could earn $16 to $20 an hour if he finished this training that's only 8 weeks long. So they agreed that they would make an exception and that he would be able to do this training. We also brought in someone from AmeriCorps, the legal aid office, who helped him negotiate the child support so that it wasn't some overwhelming thing where he had a certain percentage that was going to be taken out. Mom agreed to it. And that also meant that he was going to be able to have future visitation with his son, which was also very important to him. So we also brought in the instructor from the CNC course. He kind of came in later. Remember how I said that IRTs can evolve? So something he noticed quickly when he started taking the class was he hadn't been in school in many years, and he was behind in how to keep up. And so we brought in the instructor for the CNC class, who then really took a strong interest in John, knew that he wanted to succeed, felt that he was motivated because he brought him into this IRT, and helped him work with him one-on-one after class to help him with anything material that he didn't understand or that he needed further attention with. So all of these things are happening in place. He also had a work incentive coordinator that helped him with his SSDI, who also helped him sort out the child support issue. This ended up making him so successful. When he finished the CNC course, his instructor gave him a glowing recommendation, and he ended up getting a job right away, making $16 an hour. And if it weren't, that was already good. Then, not even more than 5 weeks later, he ended up getting a job offer for another place that was paying $21 an hour. It was great. His sober living manager, so impressed with how he had gone through this class, they worked with him, and I don't know if they did this with all the houses or just him, but they basically worked with him to help come up with a savings plan so that he would be able to pay for a security deposit and get into his own apartment, which he was able to do. Also, he was able to purchase his own car. A year after I had met with John and he was successful and we had closed this case, he came in to see me, and he had such a big smile on his face. Not only was he still working, but he was now having overnight visits with his son in his own apartment. And I can't tell you, like, it almost makes me want to cry when I think about it, because he came into us, and I will say a lot of people had doubts about him. A lot of people felt like he just has too many barriers. There's no way that he's going to be able to succeed in this. He even felt that way about himself. He felt like there was no way to get ahead. But putting that IRT meeting together helped everyone see that there really was a light at the end of the tunnel, and he could make serious and significant progress in his life. And that's exactly what happened.
That's wonderful, Sarah. Thank you so much. And I actually just got a note that apparently there's another training right after this. So I apologize that we don't actually, can you move the slide, Brittany? Have time for answering any questions, but I don't see any in either the chat or the questions box. So, oh, well, maybe there is one in the questions box. But anyway, so I just want to share with you some resources. You can download this handout. It does have Sarah and my information, contact information on it. So if you have questions, comments, or anything, please feel free to send them to our email. We would love to hear from you. There's a couple of YouTube videos and things here on other states talking about their experiences with integrated resource teams. There is an archive training on the WinTAC website that's also listed here. If you want to go to the next slide, Brittany. So we'll jump to the next one, which should be our contact information again, but I'm not sure if we put that. Have you got the next slide, Brittany?
Yeah, no, that's all we've got, but I can go back to the beginning here.
I thought I put our email again at the end, but it's at the beginning. You can download that, and please send us, you know, any questions you have. And thank you so much for having us, and moving on now to your next one, I guess. Thank you so much.
Yes, Nikki and Sarah, thank you very much.
It was our pleasure.